Economic Outlook session. Well, oh, there we go. The recording started. So welcome again, everybody. Bienvenue. Welcome to our Economic Outlook session with Stephen Tapp of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, hosted by the wonderful Northern Ontario City Chambers that include Thunder Bay Chamber of Commerce, Timmins Chamber, Greater Sudbury Chamber of Commerce, Sault Ste. Marie Chamber, and the North Bay and District Chamber of Commerce. My name is Melanie Dufresne. Mélanie Dufresne. I'm first vice president of the Timmins Chamber located here in Timmins, a beautiful snowy or overcast day here. So as we begin, please join me in taking a moment to reflect and recognize that we all find ourselves on traditional lands. I am located in Timmins, and my traditional lands are of the Matagami First Nation in the Treaty 9 region. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Timmins Chamber is proud to have submitted a letter of support, co-signed with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, supporting Hydro One's Wawa to Porcupine transmission line project, an initiative poised to transform our region by addressing the growing energy demand while establishing a 50-50 equity partnership with Indigenous partners. I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Stephen Tapp. Stephen is the chief economist at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. In this role, he is a key member of the Chamber's executive leadership team, responsible for the economic analysis and research. His focus is on developing data, analytics, and forecasting capacities to provide real-time and forward-looking insights for Canadian businesses of all sizes, in all sectors and regions of the country. He is a recognized thought leader, frequent commentator, and sought-out spokesperson on economic issues in Canada. The chambers represented here today are pleased to be members of the Canadian Chamber Network, working together on issues that affect our country. I'd now like to officially welcome Stephen.
Thank you for reading the full bio. I really feel like that was amazing. Okay, so I think we have a good part of an hour here. I have I don't know, 30 or 40 slides I've been kind of working through recently, a lot of which include discussions. And you can see my slides right now. Maybe just Melanie, verify that. Yes, we're
Absolutely.
good.
Yeah, we're good.
So what I thought I would do is I will make a version of the slides that I can send around and you guys can share with everybody who's on the call right now. Sometimes I go through the slides quickly or there's a number you want to see or things like that. So I will distribute the deck. I'm happy to take questions. Now that I've kind of got my slides up, I can't necessarily see everybody on the call, but if you want to jump in and ask a question, I see we have a chat window going there too. So if anybody wants to, Melanie or others jump in and let me know if there's a question, I can stop and pause that. And if not, then I can sort of open it up. And like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about Donald Trump. We can't not talk about Donald Trump given what's happening this week. And the way I normally start is thinking about what's happening in the global economy, quite at a very high level, thinking, just what the dynamics are, looking at the US for a second and getting into that, and then we'll talk about Canada and try to get more local as we go. So if I move to my next slide here, like I said, I'll start with the global economic side. And so this is a chart which just shows you the level of GDP growth on an annual basis. And you can see the pandemic there in 2020, and then the rebound in 2021, the global financial crisis where we had negative growth in 2009. But the main point of this slide, and I think what I've said in the header there, is that we're sort of stuck in a neutral in terms of the overall speed with which the global economy is growing. Coming out of the pandemic, we've had a lot of challenges. We had the big increase in inflation. We've had interest rates to kind of deal with high inflation. So right now, the consensus expectation for global growth is about 3%. And that's pretty modest if you look back over what a normal growth rate would be. It's not great, but it's better than some people had expected a while ago, given what happened through the pandemic. When we chart some of the forecasts out for the various economies across the world on a map to give you a better sense, first I'll just start. So there's a lot of variation, obviously, with that 3% forecast for 2025. First, between the developed. If I move my mouse, can you see that, Melanie? Or is that just me moving the
Nope, we
mouse?
can see it. Yep.
You can see it. Oh, cool. Okay, this is exciting. So I won't overdo this, but at any rate, the developed economies so advanced economies are going to be growing much more slowly. The emerging markets, which has been the story for decades now, are growing a lot more quickly and in general catching up. We start on the left-hand part of the map, looking in North America, and I'll show just a bit more on the US, but obviously the US kind of being the leading economy right now in North America in terms of its overall economic performance. Mexico, even slower than the outlook for Canada this year. Moving over to Europe, the European economies have been really dealing with well, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, a lot of energy dependence and problems and competitiveness challenges. So places like Germany have actually had negative growth for the last couple of years, dealing with the energy transition and very heavy in internal combustion engine cars and other things. So European growth has been pretty weak. UK is still adjusting to Brexit and other things, but there is much darker regions in terms of the overall shading on growth rates there. So the Middle East has been growing quite strong. You see growth at over 4% in Saudi Arabia. India has led the global economy over the last few years, and this continues to be the case for this current year, growing faster even than China, who's been dealing with some property price bubbles. Russia still working through the war and the invasion of Ukraine and all those things, but expected to eke out some growth there. So the main point of this chart is just to say if you're an emerging market or you're dealing with other parts of the world, there are some stronger growth rates to be had. And there's a lot of variation, over the world in terms of how we see things going. My next slide will be talking briefly about the US economy. Are there any questions yet? I know the global one is just more to kind of set the table. So if we don't have any,
Not that I see any
all
of
right, we're
those
good.
up yet. Yeah.
But slow me down if you need me to. A couple slides on the US just to kind of show graphically what we're seeing in the data and what businesses are telling us and what the story is. These charts are indexed to the change since 2007, before the global financial crisis, and you see the dip there in 2008-9. The dark blue line at the top is the United States, and then the teal line is the average for the overall advanced OECD economies. And just plotting there the differential where the US economy through COVID was pretty hardly hit, but came back quite significantly. Had a lot of stimulus. They were a little bit less restrictive in terms of their policies on COVID, but there was a lot of fiscal stimulus, and consumers continued to spend down all of the pandemic savings that they had. So the U.S. economy, when you look, often we compare Canada to the U.S., but even if you compare Canada across the U.S. to most of their economies, the U.S. has really been leading the pack, and the gap has only really widened over the last couple of years. There was an announcement both by the Bank of Canada yesterday and then in the afternoon, followed by the U.S. Federal Reserve. This is Jerome Powell, who's their president. And Donald Trump has already chastised him for not cutting interest rates, but pretty clear from the decision yesterday from Federal Reserve. Just put a quote in there from what he said in the press conference. We don't need to be in a hurry to adjust our policy stance. Policymakers often talk in very vague terms and negatives or other things, but basically the Federal Reserve is quite happy with the interest rate that is about 4.3% right now in the United States. Canada, on the other hand, has been cutting rates, and that's given the tariff shock and other things. But the U.S. economy has been performing relatively well, and inflation has proven a little bit sticky. It's not coming down in the U.S. as fast as a result of that. But so that's a little bit on Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve. This is probably my favorite slide of the entire deck, and not a chart at all, but a picture of if you know The Wrecking Ball by Miley Cyrus. This is somebody has done a cartoon with Donald Trump, and so of course, the election of Donald Trump for his second term is going to be a bit of a wrecking ball for the global economy in the sense of he has been elected on a platform to really shake things up and aggressively put his America First policies out there. So this is going to have some pretty big impacts for Canada's economy, obviously, and for the global economy in general. I think something that we're going to see is, as we've seen before, this is Trump's Truth Social network, after I think he was kicked off of X in the first term and then kind of came back. But I was at an event that we were in Toronto on November 25th, and this was came out a bit of left field for most of us. But the executive, claiming that on January 20th, as one of the first executive orders, he's going to put in place a 25% tariff against Mexico and Canada. The pretense for this was about the border policy, fentanyl, and migrants and other things. So that was Trump's tweet, and I was the deputy chief economist at EDC during the first term, and this one right here, I guess, was a very famous trade wars are good and easy to win from March of 2018 when he started a whole bunch of trade wars. So, first observation here is that he didn't actually bring in the executive order that he claimed that he would in November last week or in the inauguration day. So I think there was a bit of relief there. Um, but he claimed that he would do that, and a lot of people are looking forward to Saturday to see whether or not the tariff threat for February 1st will come in. But this has really been the playbook of Donald Trump to come out, to be very aggressive, and to seek negotiating wins where he can get them. And I'll just review a couple of these things. Of course, through the entire campaign, he talked a lot about he called himself the tariff man, called tariffs the most beautiful word in the dictionary, and sort of ran on a campaign where he was going to really inoculate the U.S. economy and push other folks to locate inside the U.S. The November 25th tweet or social media post I just showed you was the threat of 25% on Canada and Mexico in the executive orders. Of course, even a week before that happened, if you follow the news kind of too closely, you see the ups and downs of this, but there was a bit of a reprieve, which turned out to be a bit of a head fake, but that some of the other people involved in the administration said that, well, we might not just go to 25% right away. We might make this smaller, and we may ratchet this up over time. And that's an argument that was just made actually yesterday by the Commerce Secretary. And so people were kind of like, okay, that's pretty good. And then inauguration day, he came forward, and actually the executive order that he came forward with was not the 25% tariff. It was that there should be a government study of the US's relationship with other economies, looking at trade deficits, looking at whether the USMCA, which Trump had previously called NAFTA being the worst trade deal, and then they renegotiated, and he said it was a great trade deal. Now he's a bit more concerned about it. And so those reports are presumably due on April 1st. And he also established what he called an external revenue service to, work alongside the internal revenue service, looking as a way that tariffs would be potentially funding his tax cuts or other things. And then, it was not really more than 2 or 3 hours. And then he was at a press conference on inauguration day, and then he threatened again the February 1st. So right now, most people in Canada, our business press and others, are quite concerned about which would be this Saturday. Whether these tariffs come on or not, I think it's pretty highly uncertain, but I can show you the level of policy uncertainty. This is just a chart that tracks that by looking at media references to U.S. trade policy and uncertainty. And I've shaded here Trump's first term, where it was obviously a big increase. This is I called it pre-Trump 2.0 just because this was kind of before he was coming into office. Some of the social media and other things he's done, all of these things really being a lot more concerning for business and a lot more worrying that if we go back to when Canada and the US had an agreement, and then we brought Mexico in through NAFTA in the early 1990s. So Trump has really found a way to both attract attention, but also weaponize a lot of this uncertainty and to try to cajole people into locating the United States. So he's doing that kind of once again. I was looking for different ways. I'm not a degenerate gambler, but I was kind of thinking, are there ways that we can figure out how markets, besides the financial markets, are there other kind of betting markets where we can get some sense of people's conviction of these different threats? So the headline here is that prediction markets are kind of relatively unsure about the tariffs on Canada before March. The first one I just screen capped for you here, there's different timestamps that these would have. So Trump had threatened the 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, and looking at will this happen before March? This is looking at, this was a relatively low probability event for a while. And then when Trump, makes various different changes, you see markets and some money rushing in to think about the tariffs. But the point is, in this case, it's not a 50-50 right now, but it's certainly not the case in overall financial markets that you've seen markets fully expect or fully price in the tariffs. So they're kind of discounting that or discounting the overall impact that they might have. And then I threw another one in there for you guys as well, just because the 51st state, which has sort of been a bit of a running joke, but then became a little bit more threatening as Trump didn't stop talking about it. If you look at these same markets, the chances that people are associated with us, I guess before Canada Day there, becoming the 51st state is about 2%. So it's very low, but it's not zero. Are there any questions yet, Melanie?
Not that I see anybody's hands up, but if
Okay, dokes. All right.
anybody has questions,
Am I going too fast? Are we good? I'll keep going
No,
then.
it's good. It's good. Yeah,
Oh,
everything seems
pacing's
great.
good. Okay. All right.
It's
I just
very
need some more, I
insightful.
just need some more Diet Coke here to wake me up.
There we go.
Okay, but so anyway, as I'm saying here, there's financial markets, I think in general, the US financial markets and stock markets have not fully priced in the expectation that Trump will bring in the whole nuclear option of the 25%. But of course, the uncertainty is part of the rub with Trump to keep others guessing. So the Bank of Canada has a business leaders pulse survey that they came out with in the last couple of years, and it lets them track, real-time breaking events such as this. And after the U.S. election outcome was clear that Trump had won, they asked Canadian businesses, hundreds of Canadian businesses, what they thought the impact would be with the new U.S. administration. And so here it says Trump's win is expected to. So what did Canadian companies say? I'm taking the balance of opinion. So it takes the number of companies that say something will improve and subtracts off those that say it will get worse for these various indicators. But what you would expect, people are thinking is that their input costs will go up, and obviously that's related to the tariffs. If Trump imposes tariffs himself on Canada's exports to the U.S., or if Canada retaliates on Trump's tariff with our own tariffs, then that would increase input costs on its own. But people are thinking that there'll be higher costs as businesses. They're also, in many cases, thinking that they will have to or might be able to pass along some of the increased costs in terms of higher selling prices for their goods and services. So kind of more of a higher cost environment in Canada. It's pretty negative in terms of the overall outlook for sales in Canada, but even more so for export sales. So if you look at the difference between domestic and export sales, of course, Canada's exports would be hit harder. And then one of the usual reactions when there's a lot of uncertainty for business is to postpone or delay or entirely put off capital spending. So we do see pretty weak investment climate in Canada right now. And then on the employment side as well, not a the labor market has held up pretty well, but it's not a time where people think that they need to run out and hire a lot of people. So this is looking at kind of general business survey responses from Canadian business in the interim, since we don't have a lot of good data yet. One more cartoon. Maybe there might be other cartoons, but one more cartoon, people on this was back from the 2017, 2018, the tariff man days. So, Trump is bringing the tariffs in. When I go back and look at the potential impact in the lessons that we've learned, because we did have steel aluminum tariffs through 2018 for 13 months. So if I go back and look at the data and the analysis that we did before at that point in time, I think there's some things that we can learn that are applicable. Of course, steel aluminum are important sectors, but in terms of the overall value of Canada's exports, I think they represent about 3% at that point in time. So it's significant. It's an experimental sort of impact to show you the larger impacts. But what we saw there was the same type of thing, that there were a lot of threats, and Trump was using, I believe it was Section 232, which is a code under the U.S. system, which allowed him to both do this report to say that this was bad for U.S. national security, and we're seeing the same thing, and we're hearing the same thing from companies as well. There's a threat of tariffs, and so what is happening now, if you just look at Canada's exports of things that would be likely to be hit with the tariffs, and in this case, steel aluminum, we actually saw a lot of U.S. Importers rush a lot of their transactions ahead of the potential impositions of the tariffs. And so, if anything, we saw an increase in Canada's exports of these products prior to the tariffs coming in. They rose about 20% relative to where they were before the tariff threat. But then the tariffs came in, people had built up inventories on the business side, started to wear those down. And over the course of the 13 months that they were in place, the overall level of trade fell by about 40%. So you sort of get this buildup, and then it falls off of a cliff. These tariffs were actually similar orders of magnitude, and the steel tariffs were 25%, aluminum, I believe, were 10%. And what we saw through our math is that they basically fell kind of in that same neighborhood. Trade of Canada's exports of those goods and those goods fell by about $2.5 billion, but about 16% overall. And eventually, this was kind of brought into the NAFTA renegotiations. Eventually, we got out of that situation and things went back to normal. But it obviously was very concerning for steel aluminum producers. And at the end of the day, when you look at what happened beyond just Canada's trade, it largely just increased costs for the businesses that are using these as inputs and for the businesses themselves that are producing these things. It wasn't necessarily increasing overall production capacity in the US or anything like that, which Trump was, presumably trying to do. But so that gives us some lessons for what we might expect for dynamics if we have tariffs this time around. A lot of the stories that we tell other business audiences and the US audience in general is about the us making things together. So Canada and the US economy kind of working together on things. This is one example which shows the hamburger and was used back in 2018 discussions of NAFTA just to demonstrate that we might have beef that was a cattle that was born in Alberta and then kind of moving across the border to be slaughtered and then kind of coming back. We don't have guacamole on here, which would include the Mexican side on the agriculture, but this is giving you some sense of the fact that a lot of the supply chains that we have in agriculture, but also in other things like obviously the manufacturing side, steel, aluminum, which were there before, autos and parts, a lot of other advanced manufacturing, our financial industry and services, energy markets, of course, very highly integrated with North-South relationships that have been built for decades. So we had a paper that was called Partners in Prosperity that we presented to Trevor Toom, who was a professor from the University of Calgary, has worked on it with us. And we presented some of this at the AGM before. So just keep it a high level just to say one of the things that we learned from that paper is that the vast majority of the trade that goes from Canada to the US is accounted for by intermediate inputs to business or by capital goods. And so these are things that businesses are using to produce things and not necessarily these final consumer goods. Of course, consumer goods are still important, but the point here is that about 3/4 or more than 3/4, depending upon which way you're looking at it, of the trade is actually in business inputs. And so if you impose a tariff on the input to businesses, that's going to make those businesses less competitive. It's going to raise their costs, and they're going to pass some of those costs on to consumers. It's going to raise costs for everybody. And that's pretty obvious. We do more modeling with a bit more detail on that. And I have my graphics team cut up the money there, which is a nice little graphic for people to see. If you do the modeling on this, and the Bank of Canada actually had some modeling on this yesterday, they get sort of similar results as ours, if even a little bit worse in the second year. But we looked at the impact if there was a 25% tariff on Canada's exports to the United States, and if Canada responded, our best guess is that would basically be recessionary for Canada. It would move our growth is now in the ballpark of 2% a year, a little bit less actually. And so if you take 2% off of that, it would move from positive to negative. Our best guess again at the cost of this, assuming that this was in for a long-lived time, would be almost $2,000 a person on the Canadian side. And but the bigger point I think for the US audience is it would be significant for the US crowd as well. Almost $1,300 a person in terms of decreased purchasing power for people in the United States. And so that's something I think which is important and the message we're trying to get across to US businesses and politicians. So when we look at the modeling and try to get into some of the different areas where we see the impacts happening, we list them down, from the biggest impacts to the smallest. The value of Canada's energy exports is quite significant. Oil and gas is our biggest export to the United States, and we're responsible for about 60% of the US overall imports from the rest of the world coming from Canada and the oil sands in particular. So a lot of the hit we model this would be that energy exports would be hit from Canada pretty hard. The auto sector, motor vehicle production in general, transportation, including aerospace and others, critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, as well as forestry products and pulp and paper, the types of things that resources and energy that you think that Canada would be producing, we would sell, fewer of those things given a tariff in place in a significant fashion. We've looked at provincial vulnerability, and I'm going to get a bit more granular after this, but just to start with this, I was working with Trevor and we're trying to get some more localized numbers because we knew that the national numbers were useful, first approximation for the US side and for Canada side, but I wanted to understand more kind of where these impacts would be felt. And so this was our first attempt at that, where we sort of put Canada on a line where you've got about a little bit more than 77% of our goods exports go to the US. That's kind of running along here. So as you go further to the right, more of these exports are going to the US of the total export share. And then as you go up, this is looking at the trade intensity of a provincial economy. And so when I'm in this shaded area right here, these are the provinces that we would be most worried about. Now, we're going to be concerned about all provinces in the country in general, but these are provinces that both trade more, they're higher up on the axis in terms of the trade intensity, and the majority of their trade goes to the United States. So they would, in a tariff war scenario, be hurt more than others. So that's New Brunswick, that's Alberta, and those are related to energy and oil pipelines. And then Ontario, largely related to the manufacturing stuff that we talked about earlier. Still problematic for Quebec and others, but that's sort of where we see the biggest pain points beyond the national numbers that we had before. Things would be probably worse in those three areas. There are other places that trade a little bit less. If you're on the coast, they tend to be less trade intensive, but they can also export to other countries that are not. They can export to Europe or Asia, a bit less tied to the U.S. economy. Okay, so here's a busy chart, which if you're definitely on your phone, you will not be able to read, and this is why I'll send you the slides afterwards. I've just been doing some experimental work with some data that we've got from StatCan, which tries to drill down specifically to look at the largest cities in Canada. So we have 41 called CMAs, census metropolitan areas, where their population's more than 100,000. So unfortunately, the Sioux, North Bay, and Timmins is not included in my calculations here because their populations are just under the 100K mark. But we do have Thunder Bay on the map and in our charts, and we do have Sudbury. So these are rankings from 1 to 41 telling you where are the cities that in Canada would be most exposed. And what I've done is the similar analysis I showed you before. We're looking at how much their local economy trades, and then we're looking at how much of their export basket is going to the States, and we're doing a calculation based on that. St. John is surprisingly comes out as number one. That's the Irving oil refineries in New Brunswick. A lot of oil and a lot of oil-related products go directly from St. John, Calgary as well, right up there too. So these pipelines we think would continue, assuming that they're not exempt from the tariff. If they're exempt from the tariff, it wouldn't be that as big a deal for them. But if they aren't exempt from the tariff, there would be a bigger discount between the Canadian products and the US products, and the Canadian dollar would depreciate as well. Most of the other places that you see right on the map after that are places in southwestern Ontario that are tied a lot to the US. And as I go down here, so Thunder Bay is 13th in the sense that it's not as trade intensive as some of the other economies, but the vast majority, I think it's in this case at 99% of exports from Thunder Bay are going to the United States. So it's quite significant in terms of the concentration risk for Thunder Bay. And then the thing that surprised me a little bit were the data on Sudbury. So I don't know if there's people on the call that are representing the Sudbury Chamber can give me more insights, but the numbers for Sudbury were showing basically less trade intensity than a lot of other local economies and a lot less dependence upon the US economy than many other places. So if there's anybody who wants to throw it in the chat or give me some more insights onto the products that are shipped out of the Sudbury region beyond the United States, be interested to hear about that. But this is sort of what we see and how we've tried to use the data now to go from national to provincial and then to get as local as we can. And I think it's possible to kind of drill down even further. I've seen Trevor doing some other data that gets more local, but this will give you some sense of the places which would be really the hot spots. But in general, it would be bad news if the tariffs came in Canada. We have a Canada-US trade tracker, which we put together, and that is just sort of trying to put some of the data we have from the reports and some of the other arguments that we've had in a bit of an infographic where people can click and see the different impacts on different places. So we have a lot of stats that we pulled together. I won't bore you with some of these stats now. I think people have heard most of them by now, but we have a trade clock, which is counting the amount of trade that's happened since the start of the year, which is pretty interesting. And it's closer to like $100 billion right now, but puts it into perspective. Just in 1 month, how much crosses the border? It's $3.6 billion a day. The number of jobs and the rest of it is there. And so this is right now built at a provincial level. But if you look at the province, let's say we pick Ontario, it will tell you the amount of trade, the number of jobs that are supported, the number of companies in Ontario that export to the US, and then the top trading partners, obviously Michigan, a lot of autos and manufacturing. But we'll show you the different types of goods that we have. And then on the other side, if we also built this for the US audience, you can get equivalent statistics for different places in the United States. Okay, I'm going to pause right there, Melanie. Donna is unmuting. for a second. This was my first opening discussion on the Trump stuff. I then have other things we wrote for the year ahead on some predictions for Canada's economy in 2025. But if anybody wants to stop me now and ask me something, I'm happy to take that. And if not, I will move on.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I just wanted to highlight Mayor Michelle Boileau from the city of Timmins is also online joining us today, and most likely with her newly born baby Felix. So he's learning about the Canadian economy with us. So
Oh, is he hearing? He's hearing some Trump. I'll send the slides, and then he can see the cartoons. Might work out well
there
for
we
him
go.
anymore.
And
It looks like
I
there's a question from one of the people at the top. Do you see that? There's a hand
absolutely I
raised.
see Charlotte Robinson.
Hi guys, I'm here with a whole boardroom of folks. So Stephen, just to dig into the Thunder Bay situation there, am I interpreting that correctly that it's so high in the chart probably basically because of forestry?
So the data I have now, we have separated out into total export, total value of exports, and what goes to the U.S. and what goes to non-U.S. country. We don't have the specific breakdown of the products at this locality, but so that this may be very much what you just said is being sold. But I think the real reason that I saw in the numbers for Thunder Bay is because literally 99% of the whole basket goes to the States. So it's just super concentrated. Now, if it is forestry and it's a commodity and it has alternative markets that can go elsewhere, then that's a good news. The problem with autos and parts and plastics and things that are really specialized is if you built something on, I don't know, the Chrysler line, you're not very easily able to turn around and sell it somewhere else. If you do have a bulk commodity or something more generally, sometimes you have outside options, you can sell it elsewhere. But yeah, the number for Thunder Bay I thought was just really coming through strongly because more than any other city in Canada, their eggs are in one basket.
Thanks for
But
that.
yeah, but happy to hear kind of if anybody else knows, more about the products and things like that. We don't see that level of detail. We just see overall quantities and kind of where they go.
So you couldn't, from however that report was generated, would there be data you could forward to me that would be maybe more helpful for me in analyzing the local impacts, or is it pretty much high level?
Uh, Yes, we're using different data sources in different ways. I could give you data that is more detailed on the product side.
Okay,
The
thanks,
the, cha the
Stephen.
challenges are sometimes when they get down to we can look at locations in quite a lot of detail, and we can look at products in quite a lot of detail. But sometimes we don't know in terms of the way that things are generally produced. How many trees are going to be sold from Thunder Bay to somewhere else. But we can obviously infer in some cases where there's localized production. So I can give you likely the data here for Thunder Bay, but also we can look at products and where products are going. So we can usually get relatively local, but sometimes there's some constraints in terms of confidentiality of data or just the data not existing in some cases at a more local level. There are many thumbs coming up here. Wow, I've never seen so much excitement over one economics answer.
I see that Donna has her hand up as well.
Just a quick question about the last slide that you put up, the 19,000
Is it
plus.
this one or is it something else? Let me
No, it's the one
see.
before, you,
Am I
if,
going the other wrong way?
no, you're going the right way. You were going close. No,
Keep going.
no, keep going forward. So it was the last slide
Okay,
before you took a break. Yeah, this one.
that one.
So,
Okay, stop.
so you're 19,000, almost 20,000 companies in Ontario exporting to the US. Is that data gathered from StatsCan?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And I can source because we've had kind of a data science team pulling things together and some of our economists. So
Yeah, no,
um,
it's cool. I
I,
just wanted
I
to
believe I also know, yes, when we also purchased some customized data from StatCan to figure out more local, but I do know the number of exporters to the United States for at least the top 41 of the cities. So we actually know, the number of exporting enterprises in these places as well. So we've got, and that's not data that you could find publicly on their website. This at obviously the Ontario level, you might be able to find, but we've got anyway. So if people have questions on things, we're happy to dig through and see what we can send to you.
No worries. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Was that our palette cleanser for the before I'm going to rush through my 8 prediction? Okay. Let me do some predictions for the economy in 2025. This is, well, there are going to be a couple predictions, some of which I would say are not risky, but may or may not happen. I don't have a lot of concern about affordability concerns. So the affordability concerns are not going away prediction, I think, is pretty safe. And the reason for that, I think, is one where there's a distinction between economists and how they measure things and people and how they live. And so when we measure inflation, we measure that it's a change in prices on a year-over-year basis. And so inflation in Canada in 2024 was brought back to a normal level. It grew at 2.4%, but in every month of the last year, it was within the bank's 1 to 3% band, and the 2% target is sort of right where it is now. So inflation is back under control in the Canadian case, and there was a softer landing people thought. But the chart on the right shows you the cumulative changes in the level of prices. And so when people go out, they're not thinking in terms of what is the year-over-year change in this butter. They're looking at the butter and saying this is extremely expensive. So for rents, for mortgage interest costs, for housing, shelter costs went up a lot more than the total. The total went up a lot. And there's been about an 8% overshoot in the level of prices in Canada than what would have been the case if we hit the inflation target. And food and groceries and restaurant meals and other things have gone up a lot. So these are things that people can't, they're essential. People can't avoid them. They have to, consume them to live. And so I think the affordability concerns that we're seeing right now for households have not gone away just because inflation has kind of come back to around where the bank wants it to be. And for politicians in an election year, both provincially and then likely federally, it seems pretty clear that affordability and policies to address affordability are going to be front and center for politicians and for households. I'm going to talk a bit about the central bank in Canada. So the Bank of Canada has cut interest rates at its last 6 meetings. So since June of last year, when the interest rate was at 5%, they've gone down more quickly, in some cases cutting by half a percentage point, and then yesterday by 25 basis points. So getting the rate right now down from 5% down to 3%. Oh, the lady who's doing my recycling is looking for something. Hold on here. I think we're good. Thank you. Make sure to not edit that out at the end here. I want to keep that on. So the interest rate has gone from 5% down to 3%. Financial markets are expecting that to sort of settle in this neutral range where the bank's policy was super restrictive. Of course, a lot of the discussion yesterday at the Bank of Canada's announcement was about the tariff threat and the fact that if tariffs are brought in a significant way and for a long period of time, that's going to be a massive challenge for Canada's economy. And so in that state of the world, the Bank of Canada is really in a very hard spot because it both is something that increases prices because the tariffs will increase prices for costs for businesses and prices for consumers. But it's a really significant shock to the economy. And if you believe the numbers from their modeling or ours, it would push us into a recession. So normally the bank would want to reduce interest rates in that environment, but if they reduce interest rates, then prices are likely to go up. And so they would have a very big juggling act between letting people know who've just lived through this price overshoot I talked about, that there will be an increase in inflation for a short period of time as they try to adjust. There's going to be different adjustment mechanisms I'll show in a second, but I do expect that if tariffs come in, the central bank will be one of the key features. There's going to be a fiscal policy response, a tariff response to retaliate, but it's quite possible the bank could be leaned on to reduce interest rates significantly to try to help the economy adjust to this massive shock. And so what we've seen opening up has been a difference between in the US, where they're happy to stand put and say, our economy is growing pretty quickly, and we don't really know what Donald Trump's going to do, and we don't really know what's happened with deportations and other things, but we're happy to kind of stay where we are. Well, the opposite's been the case in Canada, where we've needed to get interest rates down quickly. And so the exchange rate in that environment, because of the tariff threats and because of the interest rate differential, has moved in such a way that I guess Canada's dollar was trading more around 74 cents if you go back before Trump was elected, or let's go back 6 months or so. And is now, and this data is not bringing January's data yet, but we're now trading at more 69, 70 cents. And so I think the expectation would be there's a lot of people looking to put their money in the US economy right now, not a lot of investment demand in Canada. These interest rate differentials, other things, it's certainly likely that the Canadian dollar will depreciate further. And if we see tariffs come in place in a significant way, it's quite likely the Canadian dollar will fall back into the mid or low 60 cents would not be off the table. So pretty significant. We talked about interest rates coming down, and we talked about the impact that would have on the Canadian exchange rate. It would also have an impact on, and has also had an impact on consumers. And consumers aren't feeling great right now, but if you look at our spending tracker data and you go back to June, the bank started cutting rates then. We have seen real spending growth kind of tick up a little bit. It's not amazing. It's gone from a low negative to a positive, but consumers have been feeling a little bit better with interest rates, from the 5% going down to the 3%. So immigration is a big part of the story in Canada too as well. The population growth data here, and my prediction is that I think that immigration is going to slow down quite a lot, but I don't think that the government's targets are going to be hit. I think they're going to have a hard time getting to that. The line shows you in blue that population growth actually has been over 3% in the last couple of years. A lot of that coming from international temporary foreign workers and international students, and that's about 3 times faster than we had normal growth rates over previous decades. The government's targets from the fall was a pretty radical U-turn, to the sense that they're trying to significantly clamp down on those inflows. And if you believe their estimates, and if they're realized, we actually would have negative population growth in Canada of a small minus 0.2%, but we'd have that for a couple years in a row. And the Bank of Canada updated their estimates yesterday. That would have a very significant impact on the economy, because if we have fewer people, there's less people spending money, and that's going to be a drag on overall growth. Business sentiment, I think it's going to stay pretty somber. We have a lot of uncertainty right now. I think people are a lot concerned about the tariffs, but they're also still dealing with debt levels that they had from the pandemic, or dealing with interest rates and other mortgage costs and things for households, less positive spending outlook. And so this is a business expectations index that we pulled together, and just to show you that it's been under the 100 mark, which is a level at the second half of last year where businesses are feeling pretty somber, not in a recessionary state like the numbers we saw back early in the pandemic. But this survey was taken before Trump was making the threats that he's been making. So when we get the data that's in the field right now, in a few weeks, my expectation is that business sentiment will be even weaker in the first quarter than it was in those quarters. And there's a lot of variation here. Just to point out, in Ontario, so that the headline number is this 96. There are other places like in Quebec, Atlantic Canada, these numbers are a little bit higher, although still, not overly optimistic. In the gap between rural and overall regions as well is pretty similar now. We do see, a bit more optimism in the rural economy in Canada than in cities. And in Toronto and in Vancouver and other places where housing has gone up a lot, there's a lot of negative consumer sentiment and business sentiment. So Ontario and BC are kind of lagging behind. And we do have this data for the top 20 cities as well. One of the last things I want to comment is just on Canada's productivity, and have a bit more of an optimistic forecast to say. I do think that we've had labor productivity statistics where on a quarterly basis, this number has been negative for 15 of 17 quarters, which through my career, I've never witnessed a period this difficult coming out of the pandemic. And so I think part of these numbers are being skewed by the fact that we had a big inflow of non-permanent residents, and often those people were working in either lower paying jobs or fewer hours than other people in the economy. So that was sort of weighing a little bit in terms of the numbers. And if we do get the slowdown in immigration, that will flatter the headline numbers a little bit more, because you'll be taking some of those impacts off. But we are expecting that this story on the productivity side will turn a corner this year, and we'll get a little bit better. And then I had given this presentation probably a year or even 2 years ago now, thinking back through, like, it's a super cold day here in Ottawa. I don't know how cold it is there in Northern Ontario, but I can imagine it's cold or colder there. We are in a difficult period. There are a lot of challenges happening right now, but the kind of bending, not breaking, we've seen the economy hold up, all things considered, have not had a major recession, although the data have not been great. Central bank kind of able to engineer a softish landing with inflation coming back to target. So there's a lot of challenges, but we are optimistic that we will be able to see through where we're at right now. And so that's where I'll summarize and try to get more to your questions. The economy has held up, all things considered, to date. Affordability, as I mentioned before, I think that's a pretty easy prediction to say, like this is a big issue for people. And so affordability concerns are going to remain a key issue for consumers and for politicians for quite a while, given the fact that we had prices overshoot a lot. I talked a lot about the tariff threats and showed you some cartoons on tariffs. This is clearly going to be a challenge for exporters, but also for those who are integrated and working with exporters for the 2025 and 2026 period at a minimum, given the renewal of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, or obviously Trump is going to threaten to withdraw from that agreement and try to exact more concessions and things. So the tariff threat and the tariffs themselves, if they come on, it's going to make it very hard for businesses to have long-term planning. And because people have a lot of uncertainty right now they're dealing with, often if they have a multi-million-dollar investment that depends upon access to the US market, they may be just pausing on that. Or in some cases, some folks are thinking about whether it makes more sense to avoid the tariffs altogether by setting up shop in the US. And of course, that's what Trump is wanting people to want to do. The dynamics that we think will be a bit of a sugar rush, I'm calling this at the start, where I do think Canada's exports are going to do better than people think in the last few months and right now, because it's going to be the case a lot of US importers are going to try to bring those things across the border before the tariffs come in place. There has been some support from the tax cut, and that's helped consumers out a little bit. And there's some money coming to folks in Ontario, I think coming soon as well, which will keep the consumer and spending numbers with lower interest rates doing okay. Final point, we do think that there will be some imposition of tariffs in some way, shape, or form, and that's probably going to cause a pretty significant slowdown or slump while they're on in Canada's economy. The Bank of Canada may need to come and be very accommodative and reduce the interest rates that are at 3% now, even lower. If they do, that will allow the exchange rate to help as a shock absorber and to go down further. It's bad if you're trying to fly to Florida on vacation. But it will ultimately save the jobs of some Canadian exporters. So that's sort of the dynamics that we see playing out. There's lots of different things that you can look on our website, but I'll also just email me directly and I'll give you my contact for that. There's more work happening on the Canada-US file and other sources I can point you to that can find out specific data sets. And here's where you can send me an email or follow me on LinkedIn, because I put out lots of other charts and features and things, but you can get a hold of me there if there's specific questions. So I realize we still have 10 minutes, so I didn't talk too long, hopefully. And I don't see if there's things in the chat because I can't see all my screen, but let me stop sharing my screen for those people. And if there's questions, happy to take them right now.
I think we have one comment in the chat from Rebecca, who said, excellent overview of our current economic situation. Thanks for pulling this information together, and your presentation could understand, which is a huge assist.
Can I do the thumbs up back? I feel like I need to hit my thank you for the thank you.
Perfect. Yes. And then we do have hands up for in Thunder Bay, I think, but Charla.
Thanks, Stephen. This was great. My question for you, and maybe this is not a fair question, but based on
Now you got me nervous. Yes, go for it. Give me your worst.
Based on the fiscal situation that Canada is in, we've already heard governments talking about, financially supporting businesses that are impacted by tariffs. But we do have a pretty significant, negative balance, like
the deficit's, yeah, there's a deficit there for sure.
We have enough money to actually get through this. Like what does that do if suddenly the government starts to spend a whole bunch of money to support business in a recession? Like what does that do longer term to our country's economic situation?
Okay, so it's a good question. It's a fair question, not a softball, but one that everybody's kind of thinking about and dealing with. So let me try to answer it succinctly and not do a long run-on answer. Like, yes, we do have enough money in the sense of this is not the same as the pandemic. The pandemic was sort of an act of God or whatever, and came in and closed the economy up and was significant. This is an act of essentially one man who has decided that he wants to impose tariffs to, make America great again or whatever it is. So I think there's a multifaceted response that needs to take place in Canada if we're to respond to this properly. On the trade policy side, I think that you will see retaliatory tariffs, and Canada did use those in steel aluminum. So I think or expect to see retaliation. Often, if there's time, there are consultations done with businesses, so business can weigh in on those and say, this is a really bad thing to put a tariff on because we need it and we can't substitute away. So there may be possible opportunities for businesses to have some input on those things, but I do think that the point of a retaliatory tariff is going to make things worse for Canada, but the point is to make it worse for the US and to make the tariffs go away in the first place. So it's not a stupid strategy, it's one that makes sense. But they need to do it kind of in a targeted way that as best they can. And then with the revenue that will be collected by the tariffs, if those come in place in a reciprocal nature, that's how you have some funding to redistribute. It's not going to be perfect, but we do know both the geographies that would be more affected, as I showed you some of those, and the industries that will be more affected than others. So I don't think that it requires a CERB style response that we had before, where checks were sent to different people who couldn't work for no fault of their own. I think you can be a bit more targeted in that on the fiscal policy side in terms of transfers and to businesses as well. And there could be tax holidays for certain companies or in general could be a way to get through. So, I mean, we are in a deficit situation and we don't have the money sitting around and we don't have parliament here quite quite clearly functioning. So I do think part of it's going to fall to the tariff side and then part of it's going to fall to the monetary policy side. And as Tip Macklem explained yesterday, that the central bank can do the best they can to help offset and adjust to this shock. But changes in interest rates alone are not going to be a savior because again, you've got higher prices and you've got a weaker economy. But I think the thing that most people agree on, and Candace has talked about this a lot, and Matt has as well, that there are things that we can do domestically and internally that make a lot of sense, and they might have made sense before Trump or without Trump. And those are the usual things that people think about. It's tax reform to make sure that we're raising taxes in a way that's efficient and not costing businesses when it doesn't need to be. And I think if you think about trade and market size, then the internal trade barrier discussion comes in where you think, why have we segmented? We have a geographically very big country, but we have very small market size. And that's part of the reason that we benefited a lot from the Canada-US agreement was because we increased the production cycle and scale. And so segmenting our markets doesn't make a lot of sense and makes us less productive. So maybe we could use this opportunity to kind of get our own domestic houses in order and do better on that side. So again, reforming the tax system or improving and reducing trade barriers would be good. So the point is, I think there's lots of different ways we can respond. And I don't know how long the tariffs will come in. I don't know if tariffs will come in. I certainly know that Trump campaigned on this. It's odd and bizarre that he would choose Canada as his place to beat up, not Mexico really to the same extent, and not China. But when we lived through this in 17 and 18, he wasn't as prepared when he first came in, so not much happened in year one. And then they brought about new people in, and they started fighting. But the main fight was with China. Now we got stuck in the crossfire of that fight. But eventually we renegotiated the trade agreement. And my point is, if I look longer term, I think that we will still have an agreement with Canada and with Mexico and the US in a trade pact in a way that is similar to what we have right now, with some concessions and some changes being made all around. But I think when we get past the Trump second term, if he leaves office happily, then I think we'll get back to some sort of normal state of the world. I think we're just going to live through a lot of very difficult times, and sometimes our best answer is not to overhype and over worry. I mean, we have calls from the media on a daily basis about everything that comes out of his social media. At some point, we need to strategize, we need to plan and contingency, but if we're sitting around talking about Donald Trump for the next 4 years, it's not good for people's mental health, but it's not good for our economy. And there's better things we can do, I think, with our time. Sorry for the long-winded answer when I said it would be short, but it's a tricky it's a tricky spot, that's for sure. And I think for people that are involved, particularly as traders, the next 2 years is going to be tough. I think, Gary, did you have a question? Sorry.
Yes, thanks, Steve. On the consumer side of things, when we see tariffs increase, prices increase, the purchasing powers of the consumer begin to decrease. But then the government, if they use stimulation funding to support that, now aren't we going to drive ourselves into a inflammatory situation where prices we see inflation beginning to increase again, where they may not be able to control that increase and in turn downturn the economy that much further?
That's a risk. So I looked through the Bank of Canada's estimates because we did our own modeling, but they just released theirs yesterday. I looked through their estimates. So I said to you, there's sort of this, they're stuck in a hard place because prices go up because of the tariffs, but the economy goes down. The bank has to do some weighting of those two things and think about how they can make the economy adjust to the overall situation. So you're right. I mean, one way that fiscal policy side could do that is to increase transfers to people. They'd have more money to spend. They'd spend more money. That would increase inflation. I think for people, my point is when I look at the numbers though, the impact on inflation is actually not as large as most people think it is. So inflation will go up, but let's say there was a one-time change of a tariff. If it came in place, I mean, in all likelihood, if the tariff came in place, we would be able to negotiate out of it, and the price would go up for a little bit, and eventually it would go away. But if prices went up once, it's almost like I just showed you in my charts before in the pandemic. We had this massive increase in prices, but inflation eventually came down and got back to normal. So the bank's got to be worried about that, but they should also worry about the fact that there will be people whose job it is to sell things to the US. They may not have jobs and there may be businesses that go down. So we need to kind of try to get those companies. Like I've talked to people in Southwestern Ontario recently and asked them, what they plan to do. I think what you don't want to do, let's say the tariffs come in on Saturday, you wouldn't want a bunch of people laying off, shutting down their doors, laying people off, particularly in an environment where a week later we could we could have Trump then wake up and then say, okay, well, you've fixed the border, and well, I'll never say that, but say something and then kind of pull them off or ratchet them down. So I think we don't want people to overreact and to make permanent decisions that are hard to undo, such as separating with labor and closing businesses. And so I think it is government's job to try to keep those people whole and keep this through. If you believe, like I believe, that at the end of the day, we'll get back to some sanity, because it doesn't make sense to thicken the border in a way that will increase costs forever. And so the business models that were predicated on kind of US market access are probably still going to be valid in plus or minus 4 years anyway. But you're right. There is a risk that inflation goes up, and it's higher now because we've already lived through a high inflation period than it would normally be. But when I look at the numbers in the bank, well, if inflation goes from 2 to 3, that's not good for people. But if you lose your job, you don't really care that inflation's gone from 2 to 3. You want your job, and that's got to be given a lot more weight than the inflation stuff is problematic, but the job loss and the separation could lead to a pretty big downward spiral for the economy, and we want to avoid that.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Don, I'm not sure if you had a question or nope, you're good. Okay. Any other questions from the group online?
Well, can I ask questions to the audience? I'm not picking on anybody, but how are things happening in Northern Ontario? What's the mood like? How the economy is doing? What are people thinking about the things that I've been talking about?
Anybody want to? I see Charlotte or Donna with their.
It's the uncertainty. People just don't know what's happening, and we're so focused on what's going to happen on Saturday. I think too, there's a lot of things that we as a country could be working on internally that should be something that we should be advocating for. And I think we have all been advocating to our provincial and federal counterparts about maybe looking at some of our internal trading barriers. I think there's just it's that uncertainty that people just don't know what's going to happen. Even like with the drop of the interest rates yesterday, a lot of that, some of that could have also had to do with a lot of the mortgage renewals are going to be happening. Those 5-year mortgage rates.
That's right.
That, when people were buying homes during COVID, I think that was another thing that scared the government, because I think that would have been a huge problem. for the government.
Charlotte, did you guys have any feedback and just general?
Yeah, I mean, we had an event yesterday focused on opportunities here in our economy. We've got, a number of mining operations potentially coming online. We've got the deep geological repository. And I mean, generally, I would say that the mood in the room with 400 people was really positive, but there's still that uncertainty. And certainly anybody on the forestry side, they're quite concerned because, 25% off of the 13% is a lot of profit that you don't have. And so certainly the forestry piece, but I didn't pick up a bunch of like, ooh, what are we going to do from the mining sector, which was a lot of the folks in the room. They were kind of, business as usual. We're pushing forward. So I guess we'll see what happens.
Well, and you're right. That's one of the areas when we talk about critical minerals and energy security and other things. I think that's obviously a big bright spot right now. And I think the way that Canada can play to its strength is by using that and saying we are a secure supplier to the United States when you could be going and buying cobalt from whatever African country or buying it from China. Why don't you buy iron and steel and buy products that are made in Canada that are coming across the border here that you can rely on and that are priced effectively and that are good quality and with high standards of labor and all the other things. So I think there is a place to position this, and I'm hoping it's not sort of an existential threat for most people. But it's obviously a tough time to live through when the Trump use of, will they, won't they, are they coming, are they not coming? I think in some cases people would prefer to have more clarity just on if they are going to come in at 2% and go up every month, at least somebody knows that and they can make a definitive plan. Right now you've got the scenario planning where we got to plan, all the way around, 45 different potential scenarios.
Anyone else want to make a comment or any other questions, Stephen, to the group?
No, I'm happy to hear. I've was looking through the list and said I've only been to Sudbury twice and the Sioux, but I haven't been to the other ones. So just to let you know, never been to Timmins, never been to never been to Thunder Bay. I've driven by North Bay. But I grew up in Southwestern Ontario, so when you turn the map over, I never kind of looked at the top part of the map. I was like, well, I don't know what people do up there. That seems super far away. And like, going to North Bay seemed like far away. So.
Oh my God.
I had so much to learn, don't I?
Oh, I'm going to take you on a ride, Stephen.
Somebody took me into mine. I was in Sudbury. I went into mine, and so, like, there's lots of cool stuff happening up in Northern Ontario. I think most people don't know a lot of how I think quality of life in general. I think is like I would just heard something on the way in on a podcast on happiness measures, and I think there's some people in some of the bigger cities in Canada are less happy about things than they are in other areas. So. Although the statistics are not as good in the sense that I can't always tell you exactly, we don't have great data for North Bay, but we have better data for Toronto. But if you had to decide where you want to live, sometimes it's not as obvious.
We do have
If
beautiful.
you want to sit in traffic, for 3 hours a day, then you.
I see Robert turned on his camera. I don't know if he wanted to make a comment. No? Okay. No problem. Well, if there's any other last questions.
People can feel free. So my contact, I'll send you the slides. But if people have follow-ups or any suggestions or feedback and want to give us some input, I'm happy to hear that too. And we can help with data, of course, all the time.
And Mayor Boileau says we'll look forward to welcoming you to Timmins. So.
Awesome. I'll work. My French is a government French. I'll work. I think I can get through the opener, and then take some questions then.
Great. And
I just wanted to mention really quick, sorry, this is Noah from Sault Ste. Marie. I just wanted to say we hosted Stephen at our AGM last year, and the membership was very receptive, and it was a great, engaging conversation. So thanks, Stephen.
That's good times.
Anyone thinking about doing that in the future, it was a great time. So yeah.
Well, thanks for the input. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Well, it was a very insightful, interesting presentation. So this does conclude today's session. I want to take a moment to definitely thank Stephen Tapp for joining us and the time that you've committed with the network today. Really insightful. I think we'll all be looking forward to what comes up on Saturday in the coming few years. And also want to thank everybody that joined us online, all the members, and thank the network that hosted this session today. And your time for participating. So we wish you all a great rest of your day, and we'll be sharing Stephen's contact information and presentation, and look forward to seeing you next time. So merci beaucoup, miigwech, and we look forward to welcoming you in some of the northern communities.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a great day.